Capability versus intent, the threat formula. Opening, the question nobody asks correctly. Here is a question that gets asked in every SOC, every threat briefing, every executive meeting the day after a headline breach. Are we a target? Almost everyone answers it wrong, because almost everyone answers a different question by accident. They answer, could someone attack us, instead of would someone attack us? And those are not the same question at all. Could is about capability, would is about intent. A nation-state intelligence service could dismantle the network of a 50-person accounting firm in an afternoon if it wanted to. It almost certainly never will, because there is nothing there worth the operational cost of doing it. Meanwhile, a bored teenager with a downloaded tool and no particular skill could absolutely be the reason that same accounting firm gets ransomed next Tuesday, because intent doesn't require sophistication, and sometimes it doesn't even require a target chosen on purpose. A threat is not a scary actor. A threat is a specific intersection. Capability, meaning the tools, skill, access, and resources an actor actually possesses, multiplied against intent, meaning the motivation and willingness to point those things at you specifically. Neither one alone tells you anything useful. An actor with enormous capability and zero intent toward you is not a threat. It is a spectator, a friendly researcher, a rival company's security team scanning the internet for their own reasons, an intelligence agency whose mission has nothing to do with your industry. An actor with burning intent and no capability is a nuisance. The disgruntled ex-employee who wants to hurt you, but only knows how to send angry emails. The script kiddie who wants to be the next big name, but can barely run a tool someone else wrote. The moment you understand this, the entire posture of threat assessment changes. You stop asking who out there could hurt us. That list is nearly infinite, and you start asking for whom right now does hurting us make sense, and do they currently have what it would take? That is a much smaller, much more actionable list. And it moves. That is the part most people miss first. Capability and intent are not fixed labels you attach to an actor once. They are live variables that shift with every proof of concept published, every geopolitical event, every piece of infrastructure an attacker gains or loses. Today's spectator is tomorrow's threat. This session is about learning to track both variables continuously, and about what happens, operationally, architecturally, and personally, in an incident when you get the read wrong. The foundation, unpacking what threat actually means. Security professionals throw around 4 words as if they are interchangeable, and they are not. Threat, vulnerability, risk, and exposure. Getting this vocabulary precise is not pedantry. It is the scaffolding the rest of the mental model sits on. A vulnerability is a weakness. It is a property of your system, not of any attacker. An unpatched web server, a misconfigured S3 bucket, an employee who has never been trained to spot a phishing email. These are all vulnerabilities, and critically, they exist whether or not anyone is currently trying to exploit them. A vulnerability sitting untouched in a system you have never told anyone about is still a vulnerability. It just hasn't met its threat yet. A threat is the actor side of the equation, and this is where capability and intent live. The threat is the entity that could exploit the vulnerability. Note the word could is doing real work there, because a threat is itself a compound idea. It's not enough for an actor to exist. They need the capability to actually pull off the exploitation, and they need the intent to choose your vulnerability out of all the vulnerabilities in the world to act against. Risk is what happens when a threat and a vulnerability actually meet, scaled by impact. It's the likelihood that a given threat, with its given capability and intent, will successfully exploit a given vulnerability, multiplied by what it would cost you if they did. This is why a critical vulnerability on an internal test server that no threat actor knows exists, and that holds no sensitive data, can carry a lower risk score than a medium-severity vulnerability on an internet-facing system that a known ransomware affiliate is actively scanning for, even though the second vulnerability is, on paper, less severe. Exposure is the surface area, how reachable the vulnerability actually is to a given threat. A vulnerability on a server behind 7 layers of network segmentation, accessible only from a jump box that itself requires hardware token MFA, has very little exposure even to a highly capable, highly motivated threat. The same vulnerability sitting on a system with a public IP and no firewall in front of it has enormous exposure to that same threat, even though nothing about the vulnerability itself changed. Here is the concrete example that makes this stick. Picture a small furniture retailer running an outdated content management system on their public website. The CMS has a known, unpatched remote code execution flaw. That is the vulnerability, fixed, sitting there, real, regardless of who is or isn't looking at it right now. Now overlay 2 different threats onto that same vulnerability. The first is a nation-state intelligence unit that specializes in aerospace and defense espionage. They have extraordinary capability, custom tooling, zero-day stockpiles, patient operators who can live inside a network for a year without detection. But their intent, almost by definition, does not include a furniture retailer. There is no strategic value in it for them. Even standing directly in front of this exploitable vulnerability, they walk past it because intent is absent. The risk this specific threat poses to this specific company, despite the vulnerability being real and despite the capability being enormous, is close to 0. The second threat is a loosely organized group of low-skill opportunists who bought a one-click exploit kit for this exact CMS vulnerability on a criminal forum for $40. Their capability, compared to the nation-state, is almost laughably small. They didn't write the exploit. They don't fully understand how it works. They are running a tool someone else built. But their intent is enormous, and crucially, it is indiscriminate. They are not targeting the furniture retailer specifically. They are targeting anyone, anywhere, running this CMS version because volume is their business model. The moment that exploit kit exists and is cheap to acquire, the intent side of the formula effectively becomes everyone with this vulnerability, everywhere, all at once. That is a live, high-probability threat, and it is the one that will actually hurt this company on a random Tuesday night. This is the foundational insight of the entire mental model. Capability without intent is a spectator, and intent without capability is a nuisance, but the moment low-cost capability becomes widely available to a population that already has broad, indiscriminate intent, the threat level does not average out, it spikes. A cheap, easy-to-use exploit doesn't need to find you specifically motivated attackers. It only needs to exist in a world that already has plenty of unfocused ones. The structural tension, precision against speed. Every mental model worth teaching contains a tension, and this one's tension is sharp. The tension between precision and speed in threat assessment. Precision means doing the work to actually understand a specific actor, their historical targeting patterns, their known tooling, their operational tempo, their motivations, whether geopolitical, financial, ideological, or personal. Precision is what lets a threat intelligence analyst say, correctly, this particular group has never once targeted a company our size in our sector, and their tooling doesn't even work against our stack. So we can deprioritize this alert relative to the other 12 on my desk. Precision is valuable because attention is the scarcest resource in any security operation. And precise threat assessment is what allows you to spend that attention where it actually matters instead of spreading it evenly across every actor who theoretically exists. But precision takes time, and time is exactly what you often don't have. Speed means acting on incomplete information because the cost of waiting for certainty exceeds the cost of being occasionally wrong. When that CMS zero-day becomes public, and a criminal forum starts selling a point-and-click exploit for it, you do not have the luxury of spending 3 days building a precise intent profile on every group that might use it. The capability has gone from possessed by a handful of sophisticated actors to possessed by anyone with $40 and a web browser in the space of a single forum post. Waiting for precise intelligence about who specifically intends to use it against you is a bet that you will find out before they do. That is usually a losing bet. This tension shows up constantly in real operational decisions. A SOC analyst staring at an alert has to decide, often in minutes, whether the pattern they're seeing represents genuine capability meeting genuine intent, or whether it's noise. And the analyst who always waits for perfect certainty before escalating will be too slow the one time it matters, while the analyst who escalates everything with equal urgency will exhaust the team's attention on false alarms and guarantee that the real signal gets missed inside the noise. A threat intelligence program that only tracks named, well-profiled apt groups with rich, precise dossiers will systematically miss the diffuse, high-intent, low-capability crowd that turns a public proof of concept into a mass exploitation event within 72 hours of disclosure, because that crowd doesn't have a name, a dossier, or a consistent pattern to profile. And a vulnerability management program that patches strictly according to a precisely calculated risk score, recalculated weekly, will always be a step behind the moment a capability shift. A new exploit kit, a leaked tool, a proof of concept going viral on social media, changes the threat landscape faster than the weekly cycle can capture. The resolution isn't choosing one side permanently. It's building a system that defaults to precision when time allows and has an explicit, pre-agreed trigger for switching to speed when a capability shift makes precision a luxury you can no longer afford. The furniture retailer in our scenario didn't need a precise profile of exactly which forum users bought the exploit kit. They needed one clear signal. Capability just became cheap and public, to override the entire, more nuanced intent analysis and trigger immediate action. That override rule has to be decided in advance, calmly, not improvised in the moment of panic. The architectural philosophy, building defenses around the formula. If you take capability versus intent seriously as a design principle rather than just an analytical lens, it changes how you architect defenses, because it tells you where to spend disproportionate effort. The first architectural implication is that you defend hardest against the intersection, not against either variable alone. This sounds obvious stated plainly, but organizations violate it constantly. A company that pours its entire security budget into monitoring for nation-state TTPs, the MITRE attack techniques associated with the most sophisticated known groups, while leaving basic credential hygiene and patch cadence weak, has built a defense against high capability while ignoring that the highest intent population against them is almost certainly not the nation-state. It's the commodity ransomware affiliate and the automated botnet, both of which have moderate capability but essentially unlimited indiscriminate intent, because they don't care who you are. They only care that you're reachable and vulnerable. Architecturally, this means your baseline hygiene, patching, MFA, network segmentation, backup integrity, has to be sized against the high-intent, low to moderate capability population, because that population is enormous and constantly probing everyone. Your advanced detection and response capability, the expensive stuff, gets sized against the lower frequency, higher capability actors who might specifically target you because of what you are, not just because you're reachable. The second implication is that architecture has to assume capability is not static, and specifically that it tends to move in one direction, down in cost, up in availability. A technique that requires a skilled operator today is very often a point-and-click tool in 18 months. This is the entire history of exploit development. Proof of concept code gets weaponized, weaponized code gets wrapped in a friendly interface, and friendly interfaces get sold as a service to anyone with cryptocurrency and motivation. An architecture built only to resist today's population of capable actors will be inadequate against tomorrow's population of anyone, because the anyone population is always larger and always growing. This is why compensating controls that don't depend on an attacker being unsophisticated, network segmentation, least privilege, application allow listing, age better than controls that only work because nobody currently has the skill to bypass this. Because skill is exactly the variable that erodes fastest. The third implication is that intelligence itself becomes an architectural input, not just an analytical output. An organization that treats threat intelligence as a report that gets read and filed has built an architecture with a blind eye. An organization that treats threat intelligence as a live feed that can trigger automatic changes in defensive posture, tightening egress filtering when a new C2 pattern is identified, accelerating a patch cycle when a capability shift is detected, increasing authentication friction for a specific user population when a targeted campaign against their sector is confirmed, has built an architecture that moves with the threat formula instead of assuming it holds still. This is the deeper reason honeypot networks and threat intelligence feeds earn their keep. They are instruments for continuously remeasuring both capability and intent. Rather than one-time assessments frozen at the moment, a risk register was last updated. Tools and the trade-offs they carry. Every tool in this space is really a measurement instrument pointed at one or both halves of the formula. And understanding a tool means understanding which half it measures well, which half it measures poorly or not at all, and what it costs you to rely on it. Consider MITRE ATT&CK. What it gives you is an extraordinarily well-organized catalog of capability, the tactics, techniques, and procedures that real adversaries have actually been observed using, mapped in a structured, comparable way across the entire attack lifecycle. When a SOC analyst maps an observed behavior to a specific attack technique, they are answering the capability question with real precision. This activity required this level of skill, this kind of tooling, this kind of access. What attack does not tell you, and was never designed to tell you, is intent. The framework is agnostic about why a technique was used or against whom it was aimed. Two completely different actors, a financially motivated ransomware crew and a state-sponsored espionage unit, might both execute credential dumping via the exact same technique, mapped to the exact same attack entry, for entirely different reasons and against entirely different target selection logic. If you rely on attack alone to assess threat level, you will correctly characterize sophistication while remaining completely blind to motivation. And motivation is often the variable that tells you whether this is a 5-alarm incident or a contained, low-priority cleanup. Consider honeypots, and specifically why they occupy a genuinely unusual position in this landscape. They measure both variables simultaneously, and that is precisely their value. A honeypot that mimics a vulnerable SSH server doesn't just tell you that someone has the capability to attempt a brute force login or drop a specific malware family. The captured binary, the command sequence, the tooling all speak to capability. It also tells you something about intent because the honeypot has no real value. Nobody attacks it for the data because there is no data. Every interaction with a honeypot is, almost by definition, evidence of intent to compromise something that looks like your infrastructure, untethered from any legitimate business reason to be there. This is why honeypot telemetry is disproportionately valuable for early warning. It is one of the few signals that is close to pure threat, with very little of the ambiguity that plagues production telemetry, where you constantly have to ask whether an anomaly is malicious or just an unusual but legitimate business process. What honeypots cost you is scope. A honeypot only tells you about actors who happen to encounter and choose to engage with that specific decoy, in that specific network position, mimicking that specific service. It cannot tell you anything about an actor who never stumbles across it, and a sophisticated actor who has already profiled your real environment may recognize and deliberately avoid an obvious decoy, which means the very capability you most want visibility into is sometimes the capability best able to evade the instrument you're using to see it. Consider commercial and open-source threat intelligence feeds. Their value proposition is that they attempt to give you both halves of the formula at once, packaged as a profile. This actor, this is their known tooling and capability, this is their historical targeting pattern and inferred motivation, here is a confidence score. When this works well, it is enormously efficient. It lets an analyst skip weeks of independent research and inherit the collective observation of an entire intelligence community. What it costs you is currency and applicability. Threat intelligence decays fast. An actor's capability, and especially their intent, can shift within days of a feed being published, and a feed is only as good as the last time someone actually verified the actor's current targeting pattern. There is also the applicability problem. A feed built from a global vantage point will surface plenty of actors who are highly capable and highly motivated against someone, but not against you specifically, and separating the signal that's actually relevant to your sector, your geography, and your technology stack from the noise of everyone else's threat landscape requires judgment the feed itself cannot supply. Consider penetration testing. This tool measures capability, but it measures your capability, not the adversary's, which is exactly why it belongs in this framework. A pen test tells you what a skilled, motivated operator could accomplish against your current defenses within a defined scope and time frame. It is a controlled, safe proxy for the capability side of a real threats equation. What it costs you is that it says almost nothing about intent, and it is a snapshot, not a continuous measurement. A pen test conducted in March tells you about your capability gap in March. It says nothing about whether a real actor's intent toward you has since changed, and it says nothing about capability drift on either side, new controls you've since deployed, or new techniques the broader attacker population has since acquired. Treating a clean pen test result as an ongoing assurance rather than a dated data point is one of the more common ways organizations quietly drift out of sync with their actual risk. Implementation, turning the formula into a working process. Theory earns its keep when it survives contact with an actual decision, so let's work through one. Imagine you are asked to build a formal threat assessment protocol as part of standing up an incident response capability from scratch. The naive version of this task is a checklist. When an alert fires, look it up, assign a severity, escalate accordingly. That version fails almost immediately in practice because severity assigned from technical indicators alone. How bad would this be if it were real? Systematically ignores exactly the variable that determines whether it is real. Intent. The better version starts by making the capability question and the intent question explicitly separate steps, asked in sequence by design. Step 1 is capability assessment, and it should be answerable largely from technical evidence already in hand. What does the observed activity actually require? Is this a known, easily obtained tool, or does it show signs of custom tradecraft? Does the technique map to a well-documented low-skill floor attack entry, or does it show the kind of operational security, clean command sequencing, awareness of common detection points, deliberate evasion, that suggests a more capable operator? This step should be fast and largely mechanical, because the evidence for it usually already exists in the alert itself, in the captured artifact, in the session log. Step 2 is intent assessment. And this is where the process has to explicitly resist the temptation to assume intent from capability alone. High capability does not imply high intent toward you specifically. And this is exactly the mistake that leads organizations to either overescalate every sophisticated-looking alert, or, more dangerously, underescalate a low-capability event, because it doesn't look like a real attacker. The intent question has to be asked directly. Is there evidence this activity is targeted specifically at us? Or is it opportunistic and indiscriminate? Targeted evidence looks like reconnaissance specific to your organization, use of credentials or information that could only have come from prior access to your environment, or a match to a known campaign that has a documented pattern of selecting victims like you. Opportunistic evidence looks like activity that would fire identically against any organization running the same software version, activity originating from mass scanning infrastructure, or activity that matches the profile of a widely available, indiscriminately used tool. Step 3 is the part organizations most often skip, explicitly combining the two answers into a decision, rather than letting whichever question got answered first silently dominate the call. A high-capability, low-intent finding, evidence of a sophisticated technique that shows no sign of being aimed at you specifically, more likely a researcher, a misconfigured scanner from a legitimate security vendor, or genuine background noise from a broadly capable actor whose current campaign doesn't match your profile, gets logged, monitored, and deprioritized relative to alerts further down the queue, but it is not ignored. Because capability without current intent can become capability with intent the moment something changes. A low capability, high intent finding, an unsophisticated but clearly targeted attempt, someone specifically trying to get into your systems using basic tools, gets treated seriously despite its low sophistication. Because persistence and clear targeting from even an unskilled actor often precedes escalation, either the actor improving their own tooling over time, or, more commonly, that actor purchasing better capability once they've confirmed a target is worth the investment. A high-capability, high-intent finding is the unambiguous critical incident, and it should trigger full incident response without further deliberation. A low-capability, low-intent finding is genuine background noise, and treating it as anything more is how alert fatigue gets manufactured. The colleague pushing back on this design will reasonably ask, doesn't this add a step, and therefore add time to every triage decision in a domain where speed already matters? The honest answer is yes, it adds a step, but it is a fast step once the team has practiced it, and it prevents a much more expensive failure mode. The alert that gets escalated as critical because it looked technically impressive, consuming a day of incident response effort, only to be closed out as a security vendor's routine internet-wide scan. Or worse, the alert that gets dismissed as unsophisticated noise, exactly the kind of low-effort probing that turned out to be the opening move of a campaign that escalated 3 weeks later, once the actor confirmed the door was unlocked. The second implementation scenario worth walking through is continuous security monitoring specifically designed to catch capability shifts, because this is where the theory becomes a standing program rather than a one-time triage habit. The naive approach treats vulnerability management and threat intelligence as two separate, loosely connected programs. One patches things on a schedule, the other reads reports on a schedule. The integrated approach explicitly wires a capability shift signal from threat intelligence into an acceleration trigger for vulnerability management. When intelligence indicates that a proof of concept for a vulnerability you carry has moved from private researcher disclosure to public exploit code, or from a narrow, sophisticated actor-only exploit to a packaged, widely distributed tool, that signal should automatically reprioritize the patch above its normal, calmly scheduled position in the queue, regardless of what the static CVSS score says, because CVSS measures theoretical severity, not current real-world capability availability. And it is exactly the gap between those two things that the furniture retailer scenario turns on. The troubleshooting lens, when the formula gets misread. Understanding the formula in theory is one skill. Recognizing under pressure that a specific misread of capability or intent has already caused a problem is a harder and more valuable one. Let's work through 3 failure scenarios properly, from symptom to root cause to fix. The first scenario is the false positive investigation that turns out to be a mis-scoped intent assessment. A SOC receives a high-severity alert. A host is exhibiting behavior consistent with a known command and control beaconing pattern, matched by a well-regarded detection rule tied to a specific, sophisticated threat actor's known infrastructure. The alert gets escalated immediately. Full incident response spins up, and after several hours of investigation, the team determines the traffic is, in fact, a legitimate third-party security scanning service that the organization itself contracts with, whose infrastructure happens to share network characteristics with the threat actor's historical C2 servers, because both are hosted on the same commodity cloud provider's IP ranges. What went wrong here is not that the capability detection failed. The detection rule worked exactly as designed. It correctly identified traffic patterns consistent with that actor's known technique. The failure was skipping the intent step entirely and inferring intent directly from the presence of capability matching indicators, which is precisely the trap the mental model warns against. The first thing you check when re-diagnosing this kind of event is whether the alert's escalation criteria required any intent-side corroboration at all, or whether it fired purely on a technical pattern match. In this case, it did not. The rule was capability, only by design, inherited from a vendor's default configuration that never distinguished between this pattern exists, and this pattern aimed at us by someone with hostile intent exists. The second thing you check is whether there was readily available context that would have quickly resolved the ambiguity. In this case, an asset inventory entry noting the contracted scanning service, which existed but was never consulted during triage because the escalation path went straight from alert to incident response without a context enrichment step. The fix has 2 layers. The immediate layer is adding known legitimate scanner exclusions to the rule, scoped narrowly to the specific source ranges and specific technique, so as not to blind the detection to genuinely hostile traffic using the same infrastructure by coincidence. The deeper layer is redesigning the escalation criteria so that capability pattern-only alerts, with no corroborating intent signal, escalate to an enrichment step before they escalate to full incident response, asking automatically before a human is pulled in. Does this source appear in our known legitimate infrastructure list? Does this destination or pattern match any documented business process? Is there any targeting specificity here at all? Or is this pure pattern match against infrastructure that happens to be shared? What this failure reveals about the underlying principle is that capability matching detection, which is most of what signature and pattern-based tooling actually does, will always need an explicit intent-checking layer wrapped around it, or the organization will systematically over-trigger on technical resemblance while underinvesting in the harder, more valuable question of whether hostile motivation is actually present. The second scenario is the opposite failure, and it's more dangerous because it looks, in the moment, like good triage discipline rather than a mistake. A junior analyst dismisses a series of low-sophistication login attempts against a handful of user accounts. No credential stuffing tooling, no automation signature, just manual-looking, occasional attempts using plausible but wrong password guesses. As unremarkable noise, the kind of background attempt every internet-facing login page receives constantly. 3 weeks later, one of those exact accounts is successfully compromised, not through further brute force attempts, but through a well-crafted, personalized phishing email that references details only someone who had been quietly researching that specific employee would know. In hindsight, the low-capability login attempts were not noise. They were reconnaissance, an actor with modest technical capability, but clear, specific, high intent, testing the waters manually before pivoting to a technique that better matched their actual skill set. The first thing to check when unwinding this is whether the original low-capability findings were evaluated purely on their technical unsophistication, without asking the separate question of targeting specificity. Were these generic, spray-and-pray attempts against many accounts across many organizations, indistinguishable in pattern from mass background noise? Or were they specifically and repeatedly aimed at named individuals at this one company? In this case, they were the latter, a detail visible in the logs the whole time but never surfaced because the triage criteria treated low capability as synonymous with low priority, without separately asking about targeting. The second thing to check is whether there was any process for tracking low capability but specific activity over time rather than evaluating each incident in isolation. Because a single manual login guess against a named employee means very little, but a pattern of them, recurring over weeks against the same small set of people, is a meaningfully different signal that only becomes visible with longitudinal tracking. The fix is to explicitly decouple capability level from priority level in the triage criteria, and to introduce persistence and specificity as independent factors that can elevate a technically unsophisticated finding. A low-capability actor showing sustained, specific intent toward named individuals over time gets tracked and escalated on the trajectory, not dismissed on the snapshot. What this reveals about the underlying principle is the second half of the formula's real danger. It is tempting to treat low capability as inherently low risk, but intent is the variable that predicts what an actor does next, including acquiring better capability. And an organization that only measures current technical sophistication will always be a step behind an actor who is patient enough to build toward it. The third scenario is the capability shift blind spot, and it's the one that maps most directly onto the case scenario in this model. A vulnerability management program dutifully tracks and patches according to CVSS score, and a documented 30-day remediation SLA for critical findings. A particular vulnerability, scored as high but not critical because exploitation was assessed as requiring significant custom tooling at time of disclosure, sits in the normal queue. 6 weeks later, a public, easy-to-use exploit for that exact vulnerability appears on a well-known forum, and within days, automated scanning for vulnerable systems spikes across the internet. The organization, still working from its original assessment and its normal SLA cadence, gets compromised before the scheduled patch window arrives. The first thing to check in the post-incident review is where the original severity score came from. And in this case, it came entirely from a static assessment made at disclosure time, based on the capability available to attackers at that moment, with no mechanism to re-trigger reassessment when capability conditions changed. The second thing to check is whether any threat intelligence source had, in fact, flagged the appearance of the public exploit, and typically in these post-mortems the answer is yes. The signal existed, in a feed the organization subscribed to, but there was no automated or procedural link between that feed and the vulnerability management queue. So the signal sat unread or was read without triggering any change in remediation priority. The fix is architectural, not just procedural. Vulnerability severity has to be treated as a value that can change after initial scoring, with an explicit trigger, public exploit code released, exploitation observed in the wild, inclusion in a known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. That forces immediate reprioritization regardless of where the item currently sits in the queue. What this reveals about the underlying principle is the one that should be the single loudest takeaway from this entire mental model. Intent doesn't need to be discovered through painstaking profiling when capability becomes cheap and universally available. Because at that point, the relevant intent is simply everyone opportunistic on the internet, which is a population that always, reliably, has some non-zero intent toward any reachable, vulnerable target. The moment capability goes from scarce to abundant, you can stop trying to precisely measure intent and start assuming it is present at scale. The role-based lens, three very different relationships with the same formula. The same threat formula sits at the center of very different daily work depending on the seat you occupy, and the differences are worth making concrete rather than gestured at. The threat intelligence analyst lives almost entirely on the measurement side of the formula, and their central skill is resisting the temptation to let one variable stand in for the other. Their day is spent building and maintaining actor profiles, correlating captured malware samples, infrastructure reuse, targeting patterns, and campaign timelines into a coherent picture of who is out there and what they're likely to do. When a new sample comes in from a honeypot or an incident, the analyst's job is not just, what does this malware do? That's a capability question, answerable through static and dynamic analysis, Yara matching, and comparison against known families. Their harder job is the intent question layered on top. Does this sample's targeting metadata, its command infrastructure, its victim selection pattern, connect it to a campaign with known motivations? And if so, does that campaign's typical target profile include organizations like the one they're protecting? The analyst who reports, "We found infrastructure associated with a well-known, highly capable group," without following through to, "And here is why or why not that group's intent plausibly includes us," has delivered half a threat assessment and half a threat assessment is often more dangerous than none, because it reads as authoritative while quietly skipping the harder, more important question. The security architect encounters this formula at design time, and their central discipline is sizing defenses against the right population rather than the most impressive-sounding one. When an architect is asked to justify a security budget, there is a natural gravitational pull toward designing for the most capable adversary imaginable, the nation-state, the elite red team, the worst-case actor, because that is the scenario that makes for the most compelling slide in a board presentation. But the disciplined architect asks the formula's second question explicitly. Given our actual profile, our industry, our data, our geopolitical position, our public visibility, which populations plausibly have both the capability and the intent to target us, and in what proportion? For most organizations, the honest answer allocates the bulk of defensive investment against a large population with moderate capability and broad, opportunistic intent. Commodity ransomware operators, automated scanning and exploitation, credential stuffing campaigns, with a smaller, more specialized investment reserved for the narrower population whose intent plausibly includes the organization specifically. An architect who inverts this allocation, overinvesting in nation-state-grade defenses while underinvesting in basic hygiene, has built an impressive-looking architecture that fails against the threat population statistically most likely to actually show up. The SOC analyst at L2 or L3 meets this formula in real time, under a clock, with incomplete information, and their central skill is running the two-question process fast enough that it improves decisions instead of slowing them down. When an alert fires for anomalous outbound traffic from an internal host to an external address on port 443, beaconing at a regular 10-minute interval, the analyst's instinct correctly flags this as capability consistent with command and control behavior. But the analyst who stops there and escalates purely on the technical pattern has done half the job. The disciplined analyst simultaneously pulls the intent thread. What is this host who uses it? Does the destination address correlate with any known infrastructure? Has this pattern been seen elsewhere in the environment, suggesting something systemic rather than targeted? Is there any indication this could be a legitimate but unusual business process, like a monitoring agent or a scheduled sync job someone forgot to document? The analyst builds both halves of the picture in parallel, under time pressure, and the resulting escalation, when it happens, carries far more weight and moves far faster through the incident response process, because it arrives already answering the question every subsequent decision-maker will ask. Is this actually aimed at us, or does it just look scary? Case scenario: the vulnerability, the nation-state, and the forum post. Let's bring the whole formula together the way it plays out in a real, high-stakes moment, under a constraint that cannot simply be engineered away. Incomplete, shifting intelligence arriving faster than a normal governance process can absorb it. You are the security lead at a mid-sized furniture retailer. Meaningful e-commerce revenue, customer payment data, a modest but real security program, nothing exotic. On a Wednesday afternoon, your team receives two pieces of intelligence within a few hours of each other. The first is a private threat intelligence report, sourced from a reputable vendor, indicating that a well-documented nation-state group, historically focused on aerospace and defense espionage, has developed a working exploit for a remote code execution vulnerability in the content management system your public website runs. The report is detailed, technically credible, and genuinely alarming to read. The second, arriving later that afternoon through a completely different channel, a researcher who monitors criminal forums as part of your threat intel subscription, is a screenshot of a forum post advertising a one-click tool for the exact same vulnerability, priced at $40, with several replies from apparent buyers confirming it works. The naive, capability-only reaction to the first report alone would be significant alarm bordering on panic. A nation-state, an exploit our exact system. But you apply the formula deliberately. The nation-state has extraordinary capability, that much is not in dispute. Does their intent plausibly include you? You pull your own risk context. You are a furniture retailer with no defense contracts, no aerospace supply chain relationships, no obvious intelligence value that would justify this actor spending an exploit, a genuinely valuable, finite resource for them, against a target this far outside their documented mission. The capability is real. The intent on the specific evidence available is low. This does not mean you ignore the report. It means you do not treat it as your primary driver for action, and you note explicitly in writing why. This actor's targeting history does not include organizations like ours, and no evidence in the report suggests that pattern is changing. The second piece of intelligence changes the calculation entirely, and it changes it not because the actor behind the forum post is more dangerous than the nation-state. Individually, they are far less capable, but because of what the existence of that forum post means for the intent side of the formula, population-wide. A $40 point-and-click exploit removes the capability barrier for an enormous population of actors who already possess broad, indiscriminate intent. They don't care that you sell furniture. They care that you're reachable and vulnerable. And reachability and vulnerability are exactly what your unpatched CMS currently represents. The intent was already out there, diffuse and untargeted, distributed across a huge population of opportunistic actors who scan the entire internet for exactly this kind of low-effort win. What changed on Wednesday afternoon is that the capability barrier keeping that population from acting just dropped to $40 and a few minutes of setup. This is the decision point, and it carries a real constraint. Your standard change management process requires a documented risk assessment, a change advisory board review, and a scheduled maintenance window, normally a 5-day cycle designed to prevent exactly the kind of rushed, under-tested emergency change that causes its own outages. That process exists for good reasons. It is not bureaucratic friction for its own sake. But the threat formula is telling you, with real evidence, that the population with both capability and intent to hit you has just expanded dramatically, and it is expanding on a timeline measured in hours, not days. You make the call to invoke the organization's emergency change process, a pre-approved, more compressed pathway that exists precisely for situations like this, requiring a single senior sign-off rather than full board review, in exchange for tighter post-change verification and a mandatory retrospective. You document the reasoning explicitly, in real time, not after the fact. The nation-state report, while technically credible, is being treated as a low-intent finding for this organization specifically, and is logged as a risk-accepted, monitored item. The forum post is being treated as a critical, immediate action finding, not because of who posted it, but because of what it does to the intent variable across the entire population of opportunistic attackers who now have trivial access to the capability. You patch the CMS Friday night, during a lower traffic window, with your engineering team on standby for the compressed verification cycle the emergency process requires. Saturday morning, external threat intelligence and your own network monitoring both confirm a substantial wave of automated scanning and exploitation attempts against exactly this CMS vulnerability, hitting organizations across many sectors with no discernible common thread beyond, runs this software. Several peer companies who patched on their normal weekly cycle are compromised. You are not, because the decision on Wednesday afternoon was driven by the correct half of the formula, not the impressive-sounding nation-state capability, but the mundane, unglamorous, population-level shift in intent that a cheap exploit kit always produces. The trade-offs in this scenario are real and worth naming explicitly rather than glossing over in the glow of a good outcome. The emergency change process carries genuine risk of its own. Compressed testing increases the chance of an unrelated production issue slipping through, and invoking it for every alarming-sounding report would quickly burn the organizational trust that makes the fast pathway usable when it's genuinely needed. The cost of the Frenite deployment included real overtime pay and the operational risk of any emergency change. And there is an uncomfortable truth sitting underneath the whole scenario. Had the nation-state report arrived alone, without the forum post, the correct call would likely have been to not invoke emergency process at all, to schedule the patch through the normal cycle, and to simply monitor. A decision that, if it had turned out badly, would have looked identical in hindsight to a company that ignored a nation-state warning. Good threat assessment sometimes means making the statistically correct call knowing that a bad outcome, however unlikely, would be indistinguishable from negligence to anyone reading the post-mortem without the full reasoning attached. That is exactly why the documentation of the reasoning, made at the time and not reconstructed afterward, matters as much as the decision itself. Closing, what the formula actually teaches you to see. The habit this mental model is really trying to install is a specific kind of discipline. Refusing to let the scariest-sounding half of a threat report do your thinking for you. Capability is the half that makes headlines, the nation-state, the zero-day, the elite tooling. Intent is the quieter, harder, more decisive half, and it is the half that most often actually determines whether you get hurt. Every alert you will ever triage, every intelligence report you will ever read, every architecture decision you will ever justify is implicitly asking you to weigh these two variables against each other, whether or not the document in front of you uses that language. The habit worth carrying forward is to make that weighing explicit, every time, rather than letting it happen unconsciously and inconsistently under pressure. Ask what this actor or this population can actually do, and ask it with real technical specificity, not vague dread. Then ask, separately and just as rigorously, whether there is genuine evidence that doing it to you specifically, or to anyone reachable and vulnerable in general, is something they are actually motivated to do. Hold both answers at once. Let the intersection, not either variable alone, tell you how to spend your attention, your budget, and your Friday night. The actors who will hurt you most are rarely the ones with the most impressive capability. They are the ones for whom the intersection of capability and intent, at this specific moment, happens to land squarely on you. And that intersection moves. Watching it move continuously, honestly, and without letting either variable's volume drown out the other, is the actual practice this mental model is asking you to build. End of session, Mental Model 42. Capability versus Intent, the Threat Formula.